So, good morning. Thank you very much for coming to this first event of the 3 days of the Literary Translation Center. My name is Stephanie Sigmuller. I'm the associate publisher of Pushkin Press, and you'll hear very little from me because I'm in a very good company here with Will Evans from Deep Vellum, who came from Texas, right? Sophie Buchan from Weidenfeld and Nicolson, AJ Van Lenen, who came from Berlin, I think, yeah. And Jill Schoolman, who came from Brooklyn. So, and I come from Putney, as you can hear from my accent. Originally France, obviously, but believe it or not, I've been here for 10 years, so I am from London. So this is the Meet the Publishers, so we all say hi, and you will hear each of us explaining a bit more what we do. But I think we should probably do a round of introduction, but also say, each of you should say what you publish, who you've published, and also please give an example of something that you've published successfully in foreign literature and say why you think it was successful. So we take a little bit away from the magic of publishing foreign literature. And I don't know who wants to start. Are you up for it, Will?
Sure. Whoa. Good morning. I will try to lean back. Can everyone in the back hear me? Bueno. Good morning. I'm Will Evans from Deep Vellum Publishing. It's a startup, not-for-profit, arts and education, cultural organization based in Dallas, Texas. And as you can imagine, I'm the only publisher doing world literature in translation in Dallas, Texas. So I just started this press up last year after doing an apprenticeship with another publisher called Open Letter Books, which EJ was working at the time. And that taught me everything I needed to know to go down to Texas and cowboy up a publishing house. And so I am doing that. And I'm focusing on contemporary literature from all around the world in translation. I'm particularly fond of Russian literature. It's what I studied in school. But I will have a heavy emphasis actually on Mexican and Latin American literature. Being based in Texas, there's a heavy dialogue between the state and the countries south of the border. And so I'm going to be publishing a wonderful array of authors. And I'm interested in a diversity of viewpoints, men and women authors. I'm trying to publish in equal numbers to do something about that problem. And so, did you want me to give an example of one of my books right now, or are we going to do it later? Okay. I guess one of the books that I'm most excited about. My books actually don't start coming out till this fall. So if you're a distributor,
so they're all successful as far as we know.
They're all successful. You can pre-order them or make a donation on my page and make all the books successful. But I have signed 5 authors, 2 from Mexico, 1 from France, 1 from Russia, 1 from Iceland. And the author that kind of best embodies my mission in a lot of ways is Anne Garretta, who is a French author. She's a member of the Oulipo, which is an experimental literary group, which is a lot of fun, and she will be the first female Oulipian to have her work translated into English, and she's never had any of her work translated into English before, even though she's done 6 novels and she's won a bunch of prizes, and even though she teaches half the year at Duke University in the States, which is where I did my graduate degree, and so I'm very excited to publish her, and not only to publish a great author, a great book, and then also something that fits my mission as a publisher and my mission as a person in life. So I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be a really good book. It's going to reach out to a lot of different types of audiences. My mom is the most excited about that book out of all the books I'm publishing. So it's a genderless love story between 2 people, and I'm like, Mom, you're a radical feminist. I'm into this. So it's been a nice surprise.
Hello, my name is Sophie Buchan, and I work for Weidenfeld and Nicolson, which is part of the Orion Group and then owned by the French company Hachette. I think I'm the only non-independent publisher on this panel. And there's very much this old wives' tale that large companies are not into books and translation. And to us, that's nonsense. We've got books like Sophie's World, The Reader, The Shadow of the Wind. And so often people think that books and translation can never be profitable. And actually what we think is when they do well, they can do very, very well indeed. I personally look after Bernhard Schlink, Jostein Garde, apologies to any Norwegians in the audience for that very mangled pronunciation, Boris Akunin, who's a very lovely Russian thriller author, and next year I'm launching a wonderful German debut, Totenfrau by Bernhard Eichner. One quick example of a book that we published a few years ago that's actually back at this fair. It's Please Look After Mother by Kyung-Suk Shin, who is a Korean author. And we had no history of publishing from Korea. We'd no network of Korean readers or translators. But these 50 pages landed on our desks, and they're this wonderful sample. And one of the questions was, why do you think that the book you published that did so well? And very quickly, Please Look After Mother epitomised that wonderful combination whereby you're in a place that's very foreign, a place that's very unknown. But the story is about very universal dynamics. It's a story about family. And it's a story that really appeals to anyone or can talk to anyone who's ever been a child, which is quite a big demographic. And so that book, it did very well for us. And we didn't really market and publicise it as a book in translation. Because so many people say, isn't it very difficult to publish, to publicise and to market books in translation? How do you do it? And what we always say is, we don't publicise, we don't market it as a book in translation. Because the whole point of publishing foreign literature, in a way, is to break down barriers. And this book did very well by Anglophone book standards. We got on Book and Bedtime, Times Book Club, we sold an awful lot of copies. I think that, in a way, is the key, that books can do very well in the mainstream if you emphasise building connections and you don't, in a way, treat these books in a vacuum, that you understand that people do want to cross these boundaries, do want to find out how people in different countries live. And obviously that's why I'm here, that's why you're here. Literature and translation is a very good way of doing that.
That's it's going to be pretty hard to top. So, EJ, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm EJ. I'm the publisher of Frisch & Co. It's a Berlin-based ebook-only publisher of literature and translation. And one of the reasons I chose to do ebooks is because of something that Sophie said, this thing about breaking down borders. And it occurred to me that ebooks and English are something that could be read really anywhere, and not just by people in the US and the UK and Canada, but people in Germany, for example, who read English and don't happen to know about a particular Brazilian novelist, say. And one of the other things I'm trying to do too is try to find a way to publish literary translation using ebooks and kind of the advantages in distribution and cost savings that they have to make it possible to do more of these kinds of books in a sustainable and commercial way. I think the most successful book I've done so far is kind of an exemplary one for what I'm trying to do. It's by a Viennese writer named Anna Kim. And Anna Kim actually was born in South Korea, but then grew up in Vienna mainly. And her book is it's a novel about Greenland. So it's kind of this, really bringing a lot of things together in this one book, and hopefully it has reached a lot of people and will continue to. I think that's about it for the introduction. So.
Very good. And Jill?
Hello. I'm Jill Schoolman from Archipelago Books. We have been around for about 10 years, and we are publishing exclusively international literature from all over the world, not focused on Europe or any particular area. And we've got 100 books out at this point, both contemporary and classic, and new translations, and sometimes classic authors that certain titles have slipped between the cracks, like Cortázar, Gombrowicz. Our contemporary living authors, we've published Elias Khoury, Tabuki, well, he just died last year. I still consider him contemporary. Yergovich, Miljenko Yergovich, Joseph Pla, classic. Who else? I don't know. Cartarescu, Mircea Cartarescu. Anyhow, in terms of a successful book, Elias Khoury, I think, was our first major success, and we brought that out. And it's a combination of reasons, I think, why it was successful. We did a serious tour with him. sent him to 5 or 6 cities in the States and set up some nice events and bookstores and elsewhere. And I think it was lucky too. I think it was like right when the book came out, there was a lot happening in the news with Israel-Palestine, and this is a book about the Palestinian saga from 48 to the present, really. And so it just kind of, people were very interested and wanted to hear the other side of the story and stories from the other, from looking at the history from the other, a different perspective. So I think it was just the right moment for that book to break out in the States, and we were very lucky. So.
That's, I think everybody, I heard the audience have a little awed silence when Sophie said, I think what we're all trying to do, which is build connections. And this is, I think, publishing foreign literature for all of us has been to build connections between the foreign book we found and think would be a great addition to the body of literature available in English. And then all our work, I think, is to try, and everybody's been very eloquent in trying and explain to the English-speaking readers why this book would be a good idea. The example I have from our end, which is which is a bit caricatural because it's so. It's on the children's side. It's a series called Archipelago, which is a very commercial French series, which is a bit of an imitation of Harry Potter, if I'm completely honest. And it was self-published in France and then sold tons of copies, and then was sold in 27 languages all around the world. So it became that international bestsellers for children. And it hadn't come into English. English is the last language that this series came into. And we, very small publishing house, bought it because no one else had been interested. It was odd at the time for us to think that a series that had sold so many copies around the world and in so many languages and was sort of an obvious proposition hadn't come to English. So we published the first book. And I think a lot of the time, what the other houses had thought when seeing this series was, oh, it will never work in English. But now that we've published it, people are starting to take a second look and go, oh, maybe it will work. And it actually does work. And it goes through very specific things, like the cover. This series has the same cover in all the other 26 languages. And we've commissioned a designer who does covers for that sort of fantasy children literature, because we thought if you're a child here and you read fantasy literature, you will recognize a certain look. So let's fit into that look. Let's package it for that. I know package is an awful word, but you'll forgive me because I'm French, so I don't really master English. We've also worked a lot on the translation, because this series is full of made-up words. So we asked someone who's a poet as well as a translator for adult fiction normally to work on this, which is fairly unusual for children's work, and so on and so on. So much of the bridge building, there's been an enormous amount of work to try and explain why this French series could be relevant for the English market. And it goes through actual tangible steps that are visual, and a lot of the translation, which I'm sure you all know. So I guess the question I have now for you guys is, do you think that we as foreign literature publishers, we take more risks than people who publish originally in English? And I think the question goes to Sophie, who does both, and then everyone else can answer.
I think things are risky in the sense that when you buy a book in English, you've read the whole thing and your colleagues have read the whole thing. So right from the beginning, you had this amazing team enthusiasm. And so taking it back one step, if I buy a book in German, I've read it, someone else has read it, but you don't have the whole team galvanized from the start. And then when it's a language that no one understands, it does become a bit more difficult, because unless you have a network of very trusted readers, which we do for most languages, it is a leap of faith. And the one thing to remember too is that publishers are incredibly selective, probably more selective than most people think. We have a very limited number of slots every year, because the danger is always over-publishing. And there's no point publishing a lot more books than you have the marketing and publicity resources to publish. So my company publishes, say, 20 books a year. but that's between 3 commissioning editors. So I'll publish about 5 or 6 books a year. So when you love so many books in English, but you turn them down because they're not quite good enough, of course you're then taking a massive risk commissioning a book that you can't read any of on the basis of 2 readers' reports. But conversely, the world would be very boring if we only translated from French, German, Spanish, and these more mainstream languages that people happen to speak in publishing companies. And that's why it's very important that we do get to know translators very well, so we can then trust readers' reports to a very high degree and take the plunge.
What do you think, EJ? Do we take more risks?
Well, I was going to say there's a sense in which you could say that what we do is, on the other hand, a little bit less risky, because quite often you're taking authors from other languages that are bestsellers, are award winners, are hugely successful in their native countries, and it just so happens that because we translate so little, these people are available for you as a publisher to publish. So maybe you don't have a sense of the whole work, but you know this person and you know the people who publish them very well. And also you're relying on the people who originally published these authors, and the people that I work with and the people that I know Jill works with and others as well, they're experts at the literature of their countries. So you have a lot to build on. I mean, it's a risk in publishing it because it's more of a challenge, but the authors that you're choosing are generally very, very, very high quality authors, and there's a little less risk in that, I think.
What do you think, Jill?
I think it's about the same amount of risk, actually. Because you're the same questions you ask yourself when you're publishing anything. I think you ask yourself, what about this book am I connected to, and do I believe in, and do I really feel a passion to bring to the world? And publishing is a risk. I mean, the whole thing. It's you never know what the audience is. If there's going to be a readership, if it's going to get reviewed, if there's going to be kind of excitement around the book or not. But I think you have to throw yourself into it and hope. I mean, I don't think there's a big difference. I don't see that there's a big difference.
Will?
Since I'm speaking last, I'll synthesize what everybody said because they're all right. Seriously, if you look at it, publishing is a risk. You pay for something up front. You hope it delivers some money in the end. So therefore, it's a risk. In translation, it's unique. Obviously, there are amazing organizations that alleviate the risk for publishers of translation, which is very fortunate. So we can pay translators, which is a cost that's not usually factored into English language literature. But the costs, I feel, when you compare English originals to translation, it's for the type of stuff I'm doing. I mean, it's a much lower cost that you're paying up front than you would for an English language original novel that you're commissioning. That's going to be written over 2 years, and maybe you're investing in the author, and just that's a real gamble. That is a different type of gamble than we're dealing with in translation. And like EJ said, the quality of the authors we're all signing is these authors have been vetted elsewhere. We're not commissioning original manuscripts in French then to be translated into English. That like, oh, Gallimard published this book in French, therefore this author is already of a really high caliber. And then a translator who is like the best translator from French brings you the book and says, I want to translate this book. You go, oh, Gallimard published this book, and this translator that is like the most respected translator from French brought it to me. The risk is just going down every step of the way. And then when the French government says, oh, we'll fund 50% of the translation if you apply, and then you go, oh, the risk goes down even further. And so then I wonder why everybody doesn't publish translations, because it's a little bit silly. And so the real challenge then becomes the risk is in selling the book and getting it in front of readers' eyes. But that's not a risk. That's a fun game to be played.
It is very fun. And so I've listened to all of you speak, and you making the same, there is the same sort of confusion in language that we have at Pushkin Press all the time, where half of the team speaks about literature in translation, and the other half speaks about foreign literature. So is there a difference? And I think people in the audience care, because a lot of them are translators. Show of hand, who's a translator? There are quite a few translators in the audience. Anyone want to take that? Is there a difference? Jill.
What about international literature rather than foreign literature? I tend to say international literature myself, actually. I'm not afraid of saying this is this literature in translation, and I obviously we celebrate translation, but I think international literature is something broad and it explains what it is. I don't know.
Like foreign sounds quite distancing, so international literature does seem to be the best compromise almost.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think that's very true. International is a very good compromise because some of these authors, I'm looking in the back and I see a friend who's from Bulgaria, and he writes in Bulgarian, but he lives in San Diego. And so he writes Bulgarian novels in San Diego. And so you're like, okay, this isn't really just about foreign literature. He's not foreign. He's about as American as anybody else. But he writes in Bulgarian, and so that's an interesting dynamic that we need to consider because all of our literature now is so tied in, our society increasingly interconnected. The EU and all these migration patterns are just crazy. And so it's kind of amazing to think. But when I'm in Dallas and I say the words world literature or international literature or the word translation, it's all just the same glaze over everybody's eyes. And so whatever I use, it's just like sometimes you have to poke people and you're like, world literature. And they're like, international literature. Literature and translation. They're like, but I don't read translations. And you're like, then that's another problem.
It is a big problem, though. I mean, it is a problem for us. I don't know what it's like in the in your markets, but in Britain, I'm sorry to say, a lot of the time people think of translation as academic or highbrow or difficult to access or even just difficult to read because it's going to be clunky and not read properly. Is that your experience? In your markets, in the US, is that what people say as well?
I was going to kind of go at that maybe from a slightly different angle. And maybe one of the reasons that literature and translation has this reputation is because there are people that do it on a grand scale that kind of find these bestsellers and translate them and do really well. But then there's this vast middle where nobody's occupying, kind of. And then there are people who do it maybe more for passion and for love, and they're doing it to find really literary books. So I think this kind of skews the kind of books that do get done, and I'm as guilty of this as everybody. And so maybe that's why it has this kind of stuffier academic reputation. But I don't find it to be stuffy or academic, so it's hard for me to understand people who might. I just find it exciting.
Okay. We can we're publishers and you're translators, so we can talk about the third party who's not here, hopefully, which is the booksellers. When we bought Pushkin Press 2 years ago, my business partner and I, off the hands of the person who had founded it 15 years ago, and we started talking to the booksellers. We said, come on, we started selling our books, take this book, it's very interesting. And we said everything that everybody's been saying about books that had been translated into several languages and that already had a history and found their readers and so on. And the booksellers just sat there and said, I can't buy it because it will never sell. And so we asked, how do you know? And they say, because it won't. And we said, but how do you know if you don't put it in your shop? And it's a little bit better now because because we and thankfully other independent publishers who are into foreign literature have convinced booksellers to take the books, put them out there on tables, and guess what? They sell, because when books are on sale, they do sell, especially if you can take it off the table and have a glance at it and read a few lines and discover that it's actually quite fun and they want to keep on reading, so they just buy it and go home. So after we've talked so much about the translator and translation, maybe we should give a few tips, and we've been asked to give tips for translators who want to go into helping us publish foreign literature. So do we have tips for translators?
Have a big family and have them all buy your book. But we're asking translators on how to sell the book. Is that what we're asking?
No, they're asking us what our tips to them is if they want to get into translation. Right, Emma? What's the question?
To be published in translation.
To be published in
yes.
translation.
That got lost in translation.
Yeah.
Obviously. My tip would be do your homework on the publishers that are interested in the stuff you're interested in. I think everyone up here has a very similar attitude towards translators, aka we love you, probably more than most other publishers. I particularly love translators. And if you send me a sample it is something I'm actually interested in, then I will read all your future emails. But if you send me something that I hate, then and it doesn't fit my list, it's a dead author, it's someone who writes very commercial stuff, it's, you know, it just doesn't fit with Deep Vellum's aesthetic, then I am not going to trust you as much next time. So keep that kind of stuff in mind. It's just true, and nothing personal. And that hasn't happened yet. I'm just saying it will happen. But if you do send me something that's like, hey, look, you publish X, then maybe you'd be interested in Y. And preferably if X is from France and then you send me somebody from Pakistan, that'd be rad, because you're opening up the world, and that's what we're all kind of trying to do. And don't be too pushy about things, because like she said, there's only so many slots you can publish every year, and everyone else is going to give their expert advice.
Yeah, it's just coming back to the point about trust, which I completely agree with. Writing readers' reports, I know it's not the most lucrative thing in the world, but it's a very good way of getting to know publishers and publishers getting to know you. So it doesn't necessarily follow that you can write a good reader's report and therefore you're a good translator. But it's a very good way of showing you have opinions that, as Will said, are very much in tune with the opinions of that publishing house. And of course, once you build that sort of relationship, your name is going to come up when we're discussing translations and the possibility of doing samples. Because sometimes what we do is we get a few people to do a sample, in which case it's very much deciding on that sample. But if we know you are ready, you write good reports, and that's also the way, especially if you do something that's non-French, German, Spanish, of actually getting these books bought by acquisition committees and opening up the market.
One thing that I would say is I saw Katie Derbyshire in the audience, and she's maybe a good example of this, is to not be alone. It's to meet with other translators and talk to them and find out what they're doing and what they know. I mean, they're great resources for everybody because they're doing what you're doing and they're going through these same struggles. And also to kind of reach out and do things beyond translating. I mean, to again, refer to Katie. I mean, she's interviewing German authors for this website she has, and she's really active in the literary community in Berlin in general, and not just in translation, but really, you know, finding a way to make herself visible and help make other translators visible in German. So I think, probably not very many people do this, but if it's possible that you're just kind of alone and hoping that just by translating and sending emails that you're going to find someone, I think you have to be a little bit more community-minded than that.
I would say it's, you know, it sounds obvious, but I think the most important thing is sending a really excellent excerpt to a publisher. I think that's also that you are strongly deeply connected to the work that you're trying to pitch, not just, you know, I just want to translate something and I'll translate anything you have. I think it's important getting in, especially when you're just starting out and you don't have a name established as a translator, to really choose projects carefully and be just wholehearted about what you're doing, and then that will come through in the work, and of course polish it and make it as good as it can be. But a longer excerpt is always better for editors as well.
Jill just stole my tip because it's happened to us. I think having a very polished sample is really very important. It's happened to us at least 5 times in the last 6 months that we've received really good author being pitched to us, but the excerpt was really terrible. And it was good that we had read the author either in the original or in a French or German translation, because we knew the idea was good, but the excerpt was not. And it's not doing justice to yourself or to the author that you're trying to pitch, to send something that's in a draft form, because it just really undermines what you're doing. And some publishers, not us obviously, but would sort of think the idea is good, but the translator is not, and then try and use someone else for the idea that you had, so you lose everything, which is really terrible. And the other thing that that will stole from me is try and get a little closer to our seat. Sometimes I talk to translators and they look at me like I'm the evil capitalistic person. I really am not. By trying to think that the book should work and should be sold, translators need sometimes, a lot of the good translators come with a full pitch saying this is why it will sell and this is how you should publish it, which is okay, doing a bit of our job but really helping the pitch. Things that don't work, saying it's a very important author and he's never been translated. But there are a lot of really important authors, and also I've noticed that booksellers and readers don't necessarily get convinced by it's a very important author. So something more elaborate by way of pitching and more possibly thinking more about the publishing and the selling is always really helpful and certainly makes us pay attention. The last thing that I thought we could talk about is, and this is my personal bugbear, is every time I go to a panel and I sit where you're sitting, the last bit of the panel is always to say how everything is terribly gloomy in the book market. It's all terrible, it's all going to shit, we should all change jobs. So I said to my co-panelists, we can talk about the trends in the market, but we are not allowed to be gloomy. No negative thing, no, the book market is shrinking, no, it's all horrible. And I think the person who should be the most optimistic is Will, given that he created his company last year, and so he does believe. But I think, so everybody should give 3 positive trends in the market or 3 reasons to hope, but only positive talk. Otherwise, it's too sad. It's the beginning of the book fair. We don't want to leave you with a bad taste. And also, once we're done giving our wise comments, then you can all ask us questions and get tips and so on. Additional tips.
Well, I don't know if I could think of 3, but it seems like, at least in the States, I'm not sure, I'm not putting my finger on the pulse here as much, but there really is a wave of interest and excitement around translation, and I've seen it grow. I think in the last 5 years, especially. Probably it's been growing over the last 10 years. But the Best Translated Book Award has come into being, and that was something new. And there's more reviews of translations, I think, everywhere. And there's an underground. I mean, there's less reviews in general. But there's definitely a lot of interest in, I think, even in the mainstream of international literature. So I think that's just growing. So I see that, at least I'm hopeful that it'll continue.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. But maybe a positive of a gloomy thing is that the reviews are shrinking, but what's replacing them, these online reviews, these people are much more open to literature and translation than traditional publishing kind of reviews have been. And that's really great news, I think, for us, but also for literature and translation in general, because it shows that there are people, there's a groundswell of support for this that maybe traditional outlets weren't really taking advantage of or reaching, or letting us know we're there.
So 3 things. I'd say, first of all, the success of Scandi Crime has meant that foreign names and book covers are a lot more now in the mainstream. So for the general readers, say 5 years ago, a foreign name might have signposted, this is very difficult, keep out. It could now signpost, say, a police procedural. So I think people, because of Larson, because of Joe Nesbo, people like that, are actually a lot more open and less prejudiced. Number 2, I'd say that even though the market is declining, people who do, whether it's an independent bookshop, independent publisher, people who publish and sell well are still surviving. And number 3, I think the model's changing. So to mention And Other Stories, which I think you know, which is this wonderful little indie. And I'm sure you know their business model. They have readers groups, and they actually enfranchise readers and translators to help commission. So the fact there's been such a sea change means we are all questioning our business models, and some very interesting business models, whether it's companies like Unbound and crowdfunding, And Other Stories, and basically acquiring with the help of readers and translators. It's quite an exciting time because we are being challenged and we're being forced to rethink what we do.
It's a perfect way to build off of what you just said, and mentioning And Other Stories is really interesting. I think that If I may borrow some TED Talk lingo, which I'm not a TED Talk kind of guy, but I think we all have seen some. So we can talk about disruption and all that funny stuff and industry models changing. And for some people, that's bad. It is. It's negative and it's gloomy for some people. But for people like us, we're a little bit more flexible. And it's a really exciting time to be involved in publishing because the industry model is changing. The door has opened at the bottom to the industry in a new way. So that you could live in a place like Dallas or Sheffield, England, if you wanted to, and start your own publishing house, and you're just as connected to the industry as you would be as if you were living in Manhattan in the 1980s. And so that's something that's really exciting. And so something I'm pretty passionate about, I know And Other Stories is into, and Open Letter with Chad Post, who inspired me to start my own press, is like we're trying to get the word out that if you're interested in working in publishing, like if you're a translator but you would like to get into publishing itself, you can do that. But then also another exciting thing is that if you're into translation and you want to get your works published, it seems like there's more places to do that now. It may not be the giant houses, but it may be a smaller house, and you don't have to sell as many copies to be successful for these new smaller startups where we don't have all the overhead and really high rent and 10,000 employees and things like that. So I'm super excited about all that. And I think it's a really interesting time building off what EJ said about digital reviews and digital readership and the ways that communities are forming around books in new ways. So in the past, it was like book clubs would be pretty much the only time people got together to really talk about books. And now book clubs are everywhere. They're online and offline. And that's a really exciting thing that publishers like us and publishers of translation have done a good job cultivating, is like networks of people who really care about this stuff and who are like going out and like we're becoming advocates for this type of literature. And that's a really exciting thing. And so if we can build that off and turn it into some massive sales, that'd be great.
Great. They were all very positive. I'll add my 3 positive trends, because I think people continue to buy books, which is probably a good thing. One example that comes to mind is the largest supermarket chain in the UK, Tesco, is now launching their Blinkbox books. It's hard to say. And they know about retail trends, so for me that's a very good sign that they're getting into selling e-books as well. The second thing is I agree with all of you. I think we're just now in a phase where there's never been so much innovation. Everybody you talk to, my cab driver this morning was saying, oh, you should really start Spotify for books. I mean, everybody has ideas about subscription, bundling, buy your physical book, get your free ebook copy. Everybody's experimenting with trying to sell books, and everybody's experimenting also making people discover new books, which I think for us who publish foreign literature is really, really good, because so many times people read the books we publish because they've got a taster or they got a 99p in the Kindle promo of something that they would not necessarily have bought if it were a big hardback, very expensive. They would have gone for a safer choice. But they're willing to give a try at, say, Finnish literature if they can read a bit and sort of get into a story and so on. So all those Vellum books and Jelly books and all those guys who are trying, giving a sample and trying to find new ways of making people discover books, I think are very good for us. And the third thing is I think it's the time last year where I felt most valuable in my job. So I'll tell you that story, and maybe the people involved are in the audience. But I was just talking about that Archipelago series that we've published. So we published the first volume in June, and over the summer all those kids were reading that. And at some point we got a tweet from someone who said, my daughter has read the first Archipelago book in English, and we're now on holiday in France. And she's desperate because she's discovered that all the other Archipelago books are available in French, but she can't read French. And then we got another tweet saying, she's gone out and bought a French-English dictionary, and she's now proceeding to read the volume 2. So I thought, when we publish volume 2 in English, I'm going to feel so valuable. All those kids who have been waiting, and this kid who's bought an English-French dictionary, and that should also make you feel good, because you see how all those kids who are waiting and all those adults who are waiting for all that literature to come into English.
Stephanie, if you wait, I think another translator might be born. So it's kind of interesting.
So we're done being wise. So do you want to ask questions where we seem less wise because we're less prepared? This lady. No, I think the lady's bringing a microphone.
You were all talking about borders, crossing borders, and I have a question because I think one of the trends in literature that I see as a translator is that we live in a more global world, and writers, they don't just stick to their cultural topics. So I translate from Norwegian, but I translated a short story about a Greek figure walking through the streets of Amsterdam by a Norwegian, or a historical novel that's written much in the style of Hilary Mantel's books about Goya by a woman who's living in Oslo. And I'm just wondering, if I'm coming to you with a Norwegian manuscript, do you want it to be Norwegian, or does that matter? How does that go into your selection?
I think that's a very interesting question, and you can only really say book by book. So especially in, say, genre fiction, if you're trying to buy crime from crime from Norway, you would probably hope it's either very international or quite specific in a way that really showcases what you expect from that genre. I suppose in a way it is easier to sell books, say The Elegance of the Hedgehog, which is obviously very, very French by a French author. But what I'd say is if the book is good enough, we don't care if the main character is Greek, it's set in Amsterdam, it's by a Norwegian. If a book's very, very good and we fall in love with the book, all those concerns fall away. So there could be some, I don't know, bonus marketing angle, publicity angle, if it's a book that's very much from that region by an author from that region. But it depends on the quality, and there's absolutely no rule there.
I would second that.
Well, we don't publish guidebooks. So it doesn't need to be written by a Norwegian about Norway, about Oslo, with all the quarters and so on. We publish fiction. So, any other question? This lady.
I translate from the other side of the fence a lot. I translate a lot of excerpts from for literary agencies in Sweden. And I was interested to probe a little bit this. You mentioned, I think Sophie mentioned the idea of reader reports, and then I think you mentioned excerpts and terrible excerpts. So maybe I'm one of those terrible translators of the excerpts.
Surely not.
I just wanted to see how to bridge the gap between the material that is presented to the publisher from the literary agent, and how then the publishing house decides who is going to translate the book, or how do we judge the quality of the excerpt. I recently translated 50 pages of a book which is soon to be released and probably going to be pitched to somebody at the book fair, during the next 3 days. But I'm probably not going to, if it's taken, I probably won't be the translator who translates the job. So how do we bridge that gap? Is there a cutoff point in communication between the literary agent might think, hey, we've got a great translator who's done this, and they've sent 50 pages over, but then suddenly the publisher has no link with the person who's actually given them the excerpt that they appreciate and made them buy the book.
I'll just say that we wouldn't take an idea if there's an excellent excerpt, we wouldn't give it to another translator. It's your project. It would be. In the case that you're doing an excerpt for an agent, it's a different situation maybe, and we'd make sure that we would check with that, like find out who Well, obviously you know who translated it. You put your name on it, but we wouldn't go to another translator if we like the project but not the translation. There's too many good books out there, so we feel like it's if you're pitching a project, it's your project and you can pitch it elsewhere. Yeah.
The thing is, we publish a lot of literature, and so there is this catchphrase that you hear in English publishing a lot, which is the voice. and it's the voice that we, when we talk about a book, we talk about the voice of a book, because obviously we can read the synopsis, but that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about a sample of the book. And so I think this is what really, certainly for us, and I can only reply for what we do, but this is really what gets us into a project, or the first step into being interested in author, is to read this sample and hear the voice of the author in English, translated, but his voice or her voice nonetheless. And so how do we... So to answer your many questions, I think the excerpts has to do justice to that voice, and we have to hear it. And then if you're not going to be the translator, then maybe you can suggest possible translators who would be able to, who would be interested into that author, and would be able to convey that feeling or that voice that you've managed to do in those 50 first pages. Does that answer your question?
I may add one little thing, which is just it helps when translators do develop relationships of some sort with a publisher. And so that is the missing link in your equation. If there's an agent between you and the publisher, then you don't know the publisher. And so please keep that in mind. So if you do want to reach out to publishers and just introduce yourself, give an example of your work, you could send the excerpt to them, and if they, just to say hi. It's just think of it that way too. Even if they don't accept it and publish that book, at least you know them and there's a dialogue. Just keep that in mind too.
And can I just add quickly too, if you do a very good sample and we don't want to buy the book, but the sample is very, very good, I would always make a note of the name of the translator, so it's quite a good way of getting your name about, even though the publisher doesn't buy that particular book.
Yeah, that's right. This gentleman?
Just, this is not exactly a question, but it could be a good advice for you. This is going to be very unpopular, but bypass agents, bypass publishers, and have a direct relationship with the author you're translating. But you need to be really good.
Sometimes I translate a lot of shit, so I don't want to translate.
The lady in the back.
This is a question about the difference between American and British English. I've been assuming that it's not even worth pitching to the American publishers, because even though I've spent most of my working life among Americans, around Americans, I've been trying to expunge those influences so that I can write in British English again. And I do think this is a question of voice and style and tone as much as a question of vocabulary, spelling, and all of those things that we're familiar with. So what do the American publishers have to say about receiving pitches written in what might read like British English, but is a book that could easily be marketed to American readers of English? Would you not prefer somebody who writes naturally in English in the American idiom, a translator who writes naturally, or would you be willing to take on a British translator who may not have the American nuances just right?
From my perspective, I'm doing literary books, and so I assume that my audience is completely comfortable with reading a British style of writing. It's not as though these things are not understandable by one group of people or the other. They're sophisticated readers, and they're not afraid of a few different misspellings or different ways of phrasing things. I think that it's not as different as people sometimes make it out to be. And I think if I was you, I would just continue to do what you're comfortable, how you're comfortable translating it, and the best way that you can translate it is going to be the way that's going to be most successful for the book, I think.
Yeah, I would second that, and then I would remind all the British translators that if you've ever seen an American movie that has foreign characters, but it's in English, they speak British English. You guys are very foreign to us, and so it can help sell our book maybe. There's a romantic foreign aspect to what you guys do over here.
And also just bear in mind that if we're publishing and a US publisher has picked up the same book, for example, this German book I'm doing in 2015, it's been translated by a UK British translator, and then it will be Americanized for Simon & Schuster in the States. But no one's worried about this. It's not an issue at all, and it happens an awful lot. So say you get a US translator to translate for both of you, and then just one party deals with it in terms of little bits of tone, spelling, grammar, but no one really worries about that too much within the industry.
Jill, do you have...
Yeah, I basically second that. There's the only question is if there's slang that's maybe not comprehensible to an audience. But then that's something that an editor and a translator work together on. As long as it comes alive as a translation, it's great.
Thank you.
Anything else? From this side? This side is asleep.
I was interested earlier, Jill said something about being cold-hearted when you're pitching a book. And I think you meant to be very, to look at it, yes, you used that expression, it really struck me, because I think what you meant was to think it through, and maybe I misheard you, but you were saying to think it through and to find the books that have been successful in their own language and be a bit calculating about it. And my experience has been exactly the opposite, is to put your passion into it. If you really, really, really believe in a book, then that's the one you should be pitching. I must have misheard you.
Yeah.
Wholehearted.
Wholehearted.
I beg your pardon.
Wholehearted, yeah. No, I that's what I was trying to say, was that
So
you need, the
I'm
translator
completely
needs to
agreeing with you.
have a connection to the work and feel that they can capture, they're able to capture their voice. Yeah.
The only other thing
If you care about it, we're going to care about it.
The only other thing I was going to say, I'm a very British person, and I have a very British idiom, but I do a huge amount of work for the American market. And if I'm ever pitching a book to an American publisher, slightly contrary to what everyone's just been saying, I would very deliberately do it in the American me, the American way I write. And I think all translating is a sort of act of ventriloquism or a sort of character acting, and you're just acting a different character. You're just putting it into a different voice if you're doing it in British English or American English.
No other question? Well, thank you very much for listening, and thank you, my co-panelists, for contributing. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the fair, and send us your pitches for good authors.
Thank you all for coming.